He walked into his living room like it had always been his, but something had changed. Everything had changed. David Jones, a 28-year-old Australian construction worker with 2 young children, was pulling on his work boots when he heard the dark knock on his door. The police were there. On the other side of that door, his fiancée, Sarah Parkinson, had accused him of sexual assault. Emotionally driven, sudden, frightening. He didn't resist. He didn't argue. He just lifted his children out of their high chairs, tucked them into car seats and followed the officers out. Behind him, Sarah, calm, composed, watched through the window. He thought, she'll recant. She knows me. She can't mean this. But in the interrogation room, her accusations came fast and precise. This time, officers listened. Charges were filed. David spent the night in jail. The next morning, he thought only of his little boy. His daughter. "I didn't do anything," he whispered to himself for the 100th time. "They'll see." His lawyer called the press, framed as "Woman Calls Police on Fiancé." The headlines were painful. "Prominent fiancé accused of assault." Online comments exploded. Myths began, proof of guilt. While the world began to believe, but this wasn't the end of Sarah's story. It was only the beginning of David's, because in that room where accusations rang like final judgments, footage captured something else. Security video, hotel CCTV, then a loop of social cameras showed David escorting Sarah inside. No resistance, no aggression. She used his body as a shield when the door opened. She looked at him lovingly. They embraced. The footage didn't lie. Lawyers demanded release. Activists demanded transparency. Sarah shifted. Her story wavered. Lawyers told the truth. Let video be proof. The district attorney paused the case pending review. Nearly 18 months of legal limbo. Meanwhile, David waited quietly in his apartment. He watched the video himself, over and over, searching his reflection for where he'd gone wrong. He saw a man who cared, who protected, who loved his family more than anything. That clip became his lifeline. It became proof not just of innocence, but of humanity. Every small gesture, every gentle touch. When the footage finally aired, overnight, local news, then global outrage, it shifted public opinion. Sarah's story unraveled. Witnesses stepped forward. She recanted key details, on camera and under oath. The court process re-eroded the fragile narrative built on turmoil. Sarah eventually pled guilty to filing a false report. David was declared innocent, and the charges were dropped. But this isn't just a story of vindication. It's an invitation to see beyond assumptions, to choose presence over prejudice, to remember that one moment of courage, speaking, filming, releasing truth, can restore a life, reshape a reputation, and rekindle trust. David didn't chase headlines. He didn't fight for pity. He fought for his children, his truth, and his dignity. And in that victory, we find real lessons about self-discipline, mindful presence, and meaningful growth. Because life doesn't ask us to be perfect. It asks us to be present, to speak up. And when faced with injustice, even personal, painful, public injustice, to remain steady. In the weeks that followed, David's world shifted in ways he could never have predicted. Former colleagues reached out, not with invitations, but with silence. Silence speaks volumes. His phone rarely rang. Invitations to birthday parties and family barbecues stopped arriving. He felt their eyes. Friends he had laughed with now avoided eye contact. They didn't want to ask. They didn't want to know. Who could blame them? Reputation is fragile. But David stayed present. He prioritized truth over acceptance. He practiced self-discipline by waking early, walking the kids to school, and keeping all promises. No distractions, no pity, just presence. And he began to rebuild, not with grand gestures, but small ones. He fixed a broken fence on a neighbor's yard. He volunteered to coach his son's soccer team. He made pancakes on Saturday mornings because his daughter craved them every single weekend, no matter how tired he was. Mindfulness wasn't a buzzword for him. It was survival. He trained himself to pause when a hostile look crossed a neighbor's face, to take a breath when he heard a rumor in the grocery store aisle, to choose calm over confrontation. He didn't chase justice now. He embodied it. Months later, at home, he sat with his lawyer's letter. Case formally closed, no charges, official innocence established. He closed his eyes and sighed. Relief. But more than that, relief, rooted in truth. With no more cameras flashing, no more reminders of courtrooms or broken friendships, David had something else to say. He recorded a private video message to his children for when they were older. Kids, I don't want you to remember Daddy as the man who was accused. I want you to remember Daddy as the man who stood by the truth, he said softly, smoothing his daughter's hair. Your mom and I love you more than headlines. Always be on the side of courage, even if no one else applauds you. That message became the foundation for his next chapter. Local organizations invited him to speak at non-profits. Neighborhood watch programs asked him to share perspectives on conflict resolution. Journalists wanted an update. How does a man heal after injustice? He said the same thing each time. You heal by showing up, even when it hurts. But there was one place he chose not to return, the hotel where the incident was filmed. It stood downtown, 3 floors of beige walls and silent hallways. The security footage had been captured there, memories the building never forgot. Walking through would feel like stepping into the past. And the past wasn't welcome yet. Instead, he set up a small workshop in a nearby community center. He called it Truth Without Fear. Every session began with his apology. To them, I'm sorry a fault in my system forced me into your life, but I'm here now and I want to help. He shared coping techniques, deep breathing, journaling, reframing harsh assumptions, and teaching children how to stay calm when the world rages. One night, a student from a local high school asked, "How did you forgive, or at least not hate, the woman who did this to you?" David paused. Then he looked up. I don't know if I fully forgive, but I refuse to hate. Hate feels heavy, and I carry enough already. He smiled gently. So I choose neither burden. That moment became a lesson for the young people in the room. The true test of strength isn't standing up, it's standing tall after you've been broken. Within a year, the story reached national legal forums. Lawyers used his case to illustrate the importance of evidence-based investigation. Hospital administrators began reviewing their internal complaint protocols. States issued policy memos. Evidence must include audio-video before arrests are requested in domestic calls. Change, incrementally, even quietly, it still counted. At home, David watched the news one night as Sandra Johansson, a senator involved in the legislative review, said his case was a wake-up call to improve crisis response systems. He pinched his daughter's cheek when she laughed at the TV's theme song. His wife kissed the top of his head and whispered, "She sees you." Because after years of uncertainty, David found his center again, not in exoneration, but in presence, consistency, integrity, and perhaps most important, in knowing that suffering isn't the opposite of joy. It can coexist and then evolve. David's days after the incident were filled with silence, not just from those who once called him neighbor, but from within. He found himself reflecting on how quickly the truth can be buried beneath fear, assumption, and bias. The footage had saved him, yes, but it also revealed something darker, the ease with which someone's life could be upended by a lie, even in broad daylight. Rather than allowing bitterness to consume him, David decided he needed to understand why it happened. He signed up for local civic forums and meetings. At first, he sat in the back, quiet, observing. But soon people started recognizing him, not just as the man from the viral video, but as someone who showed up, listened, and cared. He began speaking, calmly, clearly, about how the truth saved him, but the system almost didn't. He spoke about the difference between fear and understanding, and how easily they get confused. Young people started approaching him afterward. They saw in David a man who had every right to lash out, but chose instead to stand tall. One day, a mother brought her son to meet David. Her son had seen the footage online and asked, why were they afraid of him? She didn't know how to answer. David knelt beside the boy and said, "Sometimes people are afraid of what they don't know, but the more we know each other, the less room fear has to grow." David wasn't a hero by traditional standards. He didn't fight in wars or win medals, but he taught an entire community what courage looks like when it walks into a room and simply tells the truth. Weeks turned into months, and David found himself invited to panels, schools, and community centers. His message remained consistent. Truth matters, and how we respond to truth defines us more than any accusation or assumption. One evening he received a call from the very security guard who had released the footage that cleared his name. The guard, Marcus, admitted that he hesitated at first. He was afraid of losing his job or being caught in controversy. But when he watched the footage again, when he saw the calm way David had handled the false accusation, the quiet dignity, he realized silence would have been a second injustice. David thanked him, not just for the video, but for choosing what was right over what was easy. That moment led to something unexpected. The two men began speaking together at events. A falsely accused man and the bystander who decided not to stay silent. They told their story, not for sympathy, not for applause, but to show what courage looks like in small, everyday decisions. David often reminded audiences, it's not about what happens to you, it's about who you choose to become because of it. The woman who had called the police on him? She never spoke to David again, but she saw him on the news. She saw him at the school board meeting where parents applauded his message of unity. She saw him smiling next to a classroom mural painted by kids that read, "Assume nothing, learn everything." In her own quiet way, she had to live with what she'd done. And maybe that was the justice the world needed. Not revenge, not punishment, but reflection. David's story wasn't just about vindication. It was about turning pain into purpose. And as more people leaned in to listen, to question their own assumptions, the neighborhood began to change. Not overnight, but slowly. It became the kind of place where people nodded to one another with familiarity, where kids asked questions and adults gave honest answers, where truth wasn't feared, it was respected. And it all started because one man stayed calm in the storm and trusted that the truth would rise. David began documenting his experiences in a journal, not out of bitterness, but to remember how far he'd come, not just legally, but emotionally and spiritually. Each entry was a quiet conversation with himself, reflecting on moments when it would have been easier to lash out, to break down, or to give up. But he hadn't. One night, while sitting in a small cafe, a young man approached him hesitantly. "You're the guy from the video, right? The one they almost arrested?" David nodded slowly, unsure of what would come next. "I just wanted to say, thank you. My brother went through something similar." No one believed him. "But after I saw your story, I decided to help him speak up. Your calm, it gave us hope." That was the moment David realized the true purpose of pain isn't just survival, it's transformation. What breaks you can either make you bitter or make you better. David chose better every time. Soon after, he was asked to contribute to a city-wide initiative on community policing and racial bias training. He didn't walk in angry. He walked in ready, with empathy, wisdom, and a story that forced silence to listen. 1. Officer. An older man with years on the force approached him after the first session. He looked uncomfortable, maybe even defensive. But he said, "I never thought about it like that. That fear of not being seen for who you really are. That's real, huh?" David smiled. "It's real. But when we recognize it in each other, we start healing." The ripple effect had begun. The kids at the park who used to glance at patrol cars with suspicion began seeing officers hosting basketball games. A mural was painted across the rec center wall that read, "Respect starts with recognition." David stood quietly beside it during the unveiling. He didn't need the microphone. His presence said more than words ever could. The woman who had accused him had quietly withdrawn from several community groups. She had become the subject of online debate, of angry commentary. But David never once mentioned her name publicly. Not out of fear, but because true justice isn't about dragging others down. It's about lifting a whole community up. Years later, when a local college asked him to give the commencement address, David stood before the crowd, not as a victim, not as a symbol, but as a man who had been tested and came out more mindful, more disciplined and more grounded. "You will be misunderstood," he told the graduating class. "You will be judged, sometimes unfairly. But what matters more than the moment is your movement. Don't let one moment define your life. Define it yourself. With truth, with integrity, with courage." And when he stepped down from the podium, students rose to their feet. Not because he was famous, but because he was proof that the truth, when lived with grace, is stronger than any lie. The applause faded, but the impact didn't. After his speech, students lined up, not for autographs, but for quiet conversations. Some cried, others simply nodded. Many said nothing at all, just offered a handshake, a moment of eye contact that said, "I see you, I feel seen too." David stayed until the janitor flicked the lights. He wasn't there to be admired. He was there to remind them that even in a world that misunderstands you, you can still choose to understand yourself. When he returned home that evening, the sun had dipped below the horizon, but his living room glowed with soft light. On the wall, next to a framed print of Dr. King's letter from Birmingham jail, was the security footage. A single still image from the video, not the moment he was accused, not the chaos, but the frame where he turned, looked up at the camera, and calmly said, "I didn't do anything." That image captured something more powerful than rage. It captured restraint, dignity, and the moment truth took its first breath. David would look at that photo every now and then, not to relive the moment, but to remind himself that clarity doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply stands still in the storm. In the years that followed, David built a platform, quietly, organically. He wasn't chasing virality, he was nurturing a voice. He began mentoring youth who felt alienated or silenced, especially young men of color who'd already had their humanity questioned before their potential was ever explored. He told them what no one told him. "You are not the worst thing someone's said about you. You don't owe anyone your rage, but you owe yourself your purpose. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is breathe before you speak." Word spread. Journalists began reaching out. A documentary was made. His footage was studied in law schools, not as a spectacle, but as a case study in how bias forms, escalates, and how accountability can unravel it, if recorded, if faced, if owned. And yet, David never let it define him. The courthouse where the jury had made history invited him back as a guest speaker. The same courtroom, the same bench. He stood in the very place where he had once been questioned, looked down on, dismissed. But this time, he stood by invitation. "I didn't come here today for justice," he said, looking at a crowd of young legal interns and civil servants. "I came here for healing, because justice without reflection is a cycle. Healing is what breaks it." There were no thunderous cheers, just deep stillness, the kind that lingers when truth lands in a room, and no one dares to look away. Later, as he walked through the empty hallway, he passed by a bulletin board. A single quote was pinned on it, typed in bold. "When the world assumes your silence means guilt, make your truth louder than the lie." He smiled. He didn't know who put it there, but he knew it had come from his story, not the video, not the lawsuit, but the long, invisible road of showing up each day with integrity, with self-discipline, and with a willingness to choose growth over vengeance. That was the legacy, not the courtroom drama, not the security tape, not the news headlines, but the steady, unglamorous decision to keep walking, mindfully, intentionally, inwardly whole, in a world that tried to reduce him to a frame in a video. David had taught the world that your reaction is your power, that what happens to you isn't as important as how you carry it, and who you become because of it. Years passed. David's life changed in ways he never anticipated, not because he sought revenge or validation, but because he stayed rooted in his values. What he built from that one incident was not a brand, not a movement, but a quiet revolution within himself and within those he touched. He published a book, but not a tell-all. It was called The Power of Stillness in a Storm. Not a bestseller by traditional standards, but in community centers, college workshops, and prison book clubs, it was gospel. Page by page, he broke down how he remained calm when the world tried to provoke him into becoming someone he wasn't. Not a single chapter was about the woman who called the police. Not a single sentence was about court transcripts. Instead, it was about what came after, the harder part, rebuilding the parts of yourself that fear tried to fracture, finding meaning beyond survival, and learning that your peace is your protest. At a youth summit one summer, a girl raised her hand. She was maybe 15, maybe younger, eyes heavy with life already. She asked, "Aren't you angry, though? Like, don't you hate what happened to you?" David paused, long enough that the silence became its own teacher. "I was angry," he said. "I still am sometimes, but I learned that anger is a messenger, not a master. If I had let it drive me, I wouldn't be here with you right now. I'd be somewhere, bitter. And bitterness is too heavy to carry on a healing journey." The room was silent again, not because they didn't know what to say, but because they felt what he meant. That night, he sat alone in his hotel room, reading the handwritten notes left by students after the session. One stood out. "Thank you for showing me that I don't have to yell to be powerful." He folded it carefully and tucked it into his wallet, next to an old family photo and a wrinkled courtroom pass from years ago. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder of the long road he had walked without letting the fire consume him. David didn't just reclaim his name. He reclaimed silence. He reclaimed presence. He reclaimed every space he stepped into, simply by refusing to be who they assumed he was. And that is perhaps the deepest life lesson of all. When someone tries to define you in a single moment, you have every right to write the rest of the story yourself. Years later, a documentary filmmaker approached David. She had followed his journey from afar, read his book, seen the summit recordings, and heard whispers of a man who had turned public humiliation into quiet triumph. She wanted to tell his story, to put it on film, not for Netflix, not for profit, for classrooms, for healing. David hesitated. He had always felt that the deeper parts of his journey were meant to be lived, not displayed. But she said something. That struck him. There are young people living through the first chapters of what you survived. They don't know what healing looks like. He agreed. The filming wasn't flashy. There were no reenactments, no sensationalized footage, just conversations, long walks through the neighborhoods he grew up in, footage of him sitting on porches, visiting schools, hugging elders, laughing with kids. One clip, just 5 minutes. Long went viral unintentionally. It was him sitting in front of a group of teenagers speaking plainly. "When they called the police on me, they didn't just try to erase me," he said. "They tried to erase the version of me that had dignity, that had calm, that had a future. But here's what I learned: you don't lose your value because someone else can't see it. They can lie about your actions, but they can't rewrite your intentions. And if you keep walking, if you stay true to yourself, truth will eventually catch up." Millions watched. Parents sent it to their children. Teachers played it before homeroom. And the woman who had once called the police? She saw it too. David would never know this, but she wrote a letter she never sent, apologizing, not just for the fear she acted from, but for the damage it caused. She had changed too, quietly, regretfully. That's the thing about truth. When it stands long enough, it forces those who try to ignore it to face themselves. In time, David received awards, but he always passed them along to organizations that taught conflict resolution, mindfulness, and de-escalation. He had no need for plaques. His reward was waking up in peace. One rainy afternoon, David stood on a small stage in a community theater. No lights, no cameras, just local families gathered for a spoken word event. He was last on the list, not because he was famous, but because he was known. He stepped up, cleared his throat, and said, "This isn't a poem. It's a thank you. To the version of me that didn't give up when he was being shouted at. To the version of me that stayed calm when the police showed up. To the version of me that knew the truth didn't need to scream to be heard. Thank you for walking forward, even when every step felt heavy." The crowd didn't cheer. They stood in silence, in acknowledgement, in reverence, because they knew what it meant to walk through fire and come out with light. He stepped down from the stage and returned to his seat quietly, nodding respectfully to an older woman seated beside him. She reached out, touched his arm gently and whispered, "My grandson was arrested last year for something he didn't do. Your story gave me hope that his life isn't over." David didn't need to reply. His smile said enough. That moment, like many others, reminded him of something he had once read. True justice isn't a verdict, it's the restoration of humanity. Years passed. David never sought attention, but attention kept finding him, through letters, through news clips, through invitations to speak in places once closed off to voices like his. A prestigious law school invited him to speak on ethics. He almost declined. He wasn't a lawyer. He hadn't studied in ivy-covered halls, but the student body president, a young woman of color, pleaded in her email, "Our textbooks don't tell stories like yours." But they should. He walked into the auditorium humbly. The students gave him a standing ovation before he even spoke, and when he did, he told them about the day a stranger's fear nearly destroyed his life, and the night he wept in his car, not because of what had been done to him, but because he didn't retaliate. "I could have screamed, I could have cursed, I could have fought," he told them. "But if I had, my story would have ended in a courtroom, not because I was guilty, but because I gave them the ending they expected. Instead, I chose the longer path, the harder one. I chose to live with dignity, and in doing so, I took back the narrative." After his talk, a young man approached him, nervous, clutching a book. "Mr. David," he stammered, "I'm studying law because of you. I want to make sure no one else goes through what you did." David shook his hand, looked him in the eye, and said, "Then promise me one thing. Don't just defend the innocent. Help them believe they still matter." Back home, David's life remained quiet. He mentored boys from the neighborhood, taught meditation at the local community center. On Sunday mornings, he took long walks in the park with his dog, sipping tea and greeting strangers like old friends. But every now and then, he'd sit by his window, watching the sun filter through the trees, and he'd remember the day they tried to erase him. He didn't hate them. He didn't even wish them harm. He had long since learned that forgiveness wasn't weakness. It was strength that refused to be defined by wounds. And as the seasons changed, he saw young men walking with straighter backs, young women speaking with clearer voices, children asking deeper questions, people choosing truth, not because it was easy, but because it was right, all because he had once stood in silence, with a camera watching, all because he refused to let fear win, all because he believed him even then that truth eventually would find its way to light. One afternoon, as David sat outside the library where he often volunteered, a woman approached him. She looked vaguely familiar. Her hair had more gray now, and time had softened her features, but her eyes still carried something, uncertainty, perhaps guilt. "You may not remember me," she began hesitantly. He looked up, calm and open. "I remember faces better than names," he said gently. She sat on the bench beside him. "My name is Karen. I was the one who called the police on you that day, outside the cafe." There was a long pause. She looked down at her hands, fumbling with the edge of her scarf. "I've carried that moment for years. I saw the footage. I saw what I did to you. I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed to say it. I was wrong." David nodded slowly. "You were afraid," he said, "not as a dismissal, but as a recognition." "I was," she admitted, "but fear doesn't justify harm. I thought I was protecting something, my comfort, my space, but I took away your dignity." David turned to face her. "Do you know what changed the outcome?" She looked up, confused. "You came forward." "Now most people wouldn't," he said. "It's not about erasing the past, it's about what we do with it." Tears welled up in her eyes. "I've tried to do better. I joined a community group. I talk to my kids about prejudice. I want them to see people, not shadows." He smiled softly. "That's all any of us can do. Grow, teach better, live better." They sat in silence a moment longer until she stood and whispered, "Thank you, David." After she left, A young boy who had been playing nearby ran up to David. "Was that your friend?" the boy asked. David chuckled. "She might be. Maybe not yet, but maybe one day." The boy tilted his head. "Why'd she look so sad?" "Because sometimes when people finally see clearly, it hurts. But she's better now." "She's trying to be," David said. "That's the start." Later that week, David attended a restorative justice forum in a nearby city. A panel of speakers, most of them formerly incarcerated or falsely accused, shared stories, not of bitterness, but of growth, healing, and rebuilding. David waited until the end to speak. He walked to the front, looked at the audience, and said simply, "I once thought my silence would protect me. I was wrong. It was only when I spoke, calmly and clearly, that I realized truth has power, not to erase the pain, but to give it meaning." An older man in the back stood and clapped, then another, then the whole room. Truth, David had come. To learn wasn't just a shield. It was a bridge that connected past and future, ignorance and understanding, fear and compassion. And every time he told his story, the bridge grew stronger. Years later, a young journalist wrote a feature about him. The article went viral. It was titled, "The Man Who Chose Grace Over Rage." But David didn't read the comments or chase the spotlight. He still walked his dog, still taught the boys at the center how to sit still and breathe, still waved at strangers on park benches. He had found peace. Not because the world had changed, but because he had. And in doing so, he had become a quiet revolution. ChatGPT said, years passed. David's story, once a spark in a quiet corner of the internet, had grown into a steady flame. University classes dissected it, social media reposted it in waves every few months, and teachers used it in schools as an example of integrity in the face of injustice. But to David, the most meaningful echoes of that moment didn't come from headlines. They came from lives, small, seemingly unremarkable encounters that proved the ripples were real. One day, at the end of a meditation session he was leading, at a local youth program, a teenage girl approached him. She had a notebook clutched to her chest and eyes filled with both hesitation and hope. "I saw your story online," she began. "The one where the woman called the cops on you. I printed it out and gave it to my dad." David tilted his head, listening. "He always told me to stay quiet and not to make trouble. But when he read your story, he just sat there, staring at the page. Then he said, 'Maybe speaking up isn't the same as acting out.'" That was the first time he ever said something like that. David smiled. "Words are seeds. Sometimes it just takes a while for them to take root." The girl smiled back. "I'm writing my own story now. I think I want to be a lawyer, a good one." David nodded, his heart full. The world needs more of those. In another moment, in a different part of the city, a corporate office buzzed with an unusual tension. A manager who had been quietly reprimanding employees for non-professionalism based on appearance and accent had finally been challenged. Not by HR, but by a quiet intern who emailed a video, David's story. "I thought you should see what this kind of thinking leads to," she had written. The manager, caught off guard, didn't retaliate. Instead, he called a meeting, opened the floor and listened for the first time. Not to respond, but to understand. The intern never spoke of it again. But she noticed the difference. More smiles in the hallway, fewer passive-aggressive jokes, more willingness to see people for who they were instead of what box they fit. David never knew about that intern. He didn't need to, because he'd come to understand something bigger than vindication. The real power of truth wasn't in public victories. It was in quiet revolutions, shifts in the invisible, in the everyday, where real change begins. He often said to those who asked, "The goal isn't to win arguments. It's to win understanding." That line would be quoted in books, screenplays, even on protest signs. But to David, they were just words to live by. Years later, in a classroom in another state, a high school debate student stood to speak. The topic was justice. His voice trembled at first, but gained strength with each word. "My uncle was falsely accused. He stayed silent out of fear. But I read David's story, and I realized silence doesn't protect you. Truth does. His teammates clapped. The teacher, moved, gave him a knowing nod. That night, the student wrote an email to David. He didn't expect a reply. He just wanted to say thank you. And David, sitting in his small home with warm light streaming through his window, replied the same way he always did. Your voice matters. Speak it with truth. Carry it with grace. Because for David, that was the real legacy. Not the courtroom footage, not the headlines, not even the trial that turned public perception upside down. The legacy was the light people carried forward after hearing the truth. One quiet act of courage had ignited thousands, not because he sought revenge, but because he chose to rise. And in doing so, he gave others permission to rise too. And so the story did keep going, not in courtrooms or breaking news banners, but in the subtle rewiring of minds, in the deep recalibration of hearts. David began receiving invitations to speak, not at rallies or panels where tempers ran high, but in spaces that required more than noise. Universities invited him to ethics courses. Community centers asked him to sit in healing circles. High schools hosted courage conversations and played a quiet clip, that grainy video footage that changed everything. Yet, David never branded himself as an activist. He wore no cape, bore no slogans. He was simply a man who had once stood, accused and decided not to crumble. He began teaching one simple idea. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the insistence on truth, even when fear screams loudest. In a small-town library in Georgia, a local police cadet sat through one of David's recorded talks. His department had just introduced new cultural sensitivity training after a lawsuit rocked the force. The cadet had come expecting buzzwords. Instead, he found a quiet man explaining how dignity works like a mirror. The way you treat others reflects how you truly see yourself. That cadet would later become a police chief. And his first order of business, installing body cams and creating an anonymous misconduct reporting line, not as a formality, but as a promise that what had happened to David would never be tolerated under his watch. Meanwhile, David's daughter, the one who once clung to her father's side in fear, grew older, stronger. She had learned early that pain does not dissolve by ignoring it. It must be faced, shaped, and gently taught to serve something greater. She grew up and became a teacher. In her classroom, there was a corner with a small poster. Truth does not shout, it stands. Beneath it, a frame with a screenshot of the courtroom video. Sometimes students asked, "Who's that?" She would smile and reply, "That's my father. The man who taught me that silence in the face of wrong isn't politeness, it's permission." One student once muttered, "But what can we do? We're just kids." She walked to the window, pointed to the street. "How you can choose to see, really see at the people everyone else rushes past. You can listen when it's easier to scroll. And if something feels wrong, you speak up, even if your voice shakes." That student, a quiet boy who never spoke, much would go on to report a teacher who had been quietly mocking a disabled student. It sparked an investigation and a change in district-wide policy. Years after the courtroom case, David's name had become more than a moment. It had become a marker, not of victimhood, but of resolve, of self-control in the storm, of using pain as an engine, not a weapon. He wrote a book, not about his trial, but about restraint, how to hold your own humanity when others try to strip it away. The title? Still Standing. It wasn't a bestseller, but it changed people. 1. Reader was a young woman named Eliza, recently fired after speaking out against racial bias at her job. HR had buried the complaint. Her confidence was crushed. She had been scrolling online late at night, looking for something, anything that might make sense of it. She found David's interview on a podcast. She listened, rewound, listened. Again. Then she stood up, took a deep breath, and started writing. Not an angry tweet, a full, detailed, balanced report. She didn't just send it to her old employer. She sent it to the EEOC. Then she shared her story with a journalist. The article sparked public outcry. The company issued a formal apology. An internal audit led to leadership changes. Eliza wasn't seeking revenge. She just wanted someone to say, "You were right to speak." And David had done that, not directly, but by proving that truth, when wielded with dignity, leaves no one unchanged. In his final speaking tour, David stood before an auditorium, full of students, activists, police, teachers, and those who didn't fit into any category. He didn't raise his voice, he simply said, "You will be told to wait, to tone it down, to make yourself small enough to be palatable. But you were not built to be manageable. You were built to be meaningful." He looked around, saw nods, saw tears, saw clenched jaws of understanding. Then he added, "It is not easy. It will cost you. But speaking the truth, calmly and clearly, with your head high, that is how we remind the world, dignity is not given, it is lived." They stood. Not out of obligation, but reverence. David had never set out to inspire. He had only tried to live without shrinking. And that had been enough, because sometimes the quietest story, when lived with unshakable honesty, becomes the loudest legacy. He never imagined that the quiet decision to keep standing, to keep breathing calmly while falsely accused, would ripple so far. After that final speaking tour, David retreated from the spotlight, not in bitterness, but in peace. He returned to his hometown, where sidewalks still remembered his footsteps and old. Neighbors still called him Kid. He bought a small piece of land outside the city, a place where trees outnumbered streetlights, and silence wasn't heavy, it was healing. He built a porch with his own hands, not because he needed a place to sit, but because he understood something. Now healing isn't passive, it's carpentry, it's deliberate, and like all construction, it takes time. One by one, others found their way to that porch. A teenage boy, expelled for standing up for his bullied friend, came and asked, "How do I keep fighting when the system always wins?" David didn't lecture. He just handed him a cup of tea and said, "First, stop seeing life as a fight, see it as a field. Grow something that outlives your frustration." A woman, an ex-journalist who lost her job after refusing to write a slanted piece, came, her hands shaking with regret. "Was it worth it?" she asked. David replied, "If you still feel the weight of your integrity, then yes, you carried something most people abandoned long ago." Eventually, that woman created a non-profit training young journalists in ethical storytelling. One of her students uncovered corruption in a housing authority and helped hundreds of tenants receive justice. David never claimed credit, because that was never the point. He taught people through living that truth isn't a headline, it's a habit, and habits over time shape history. In his old age, David found himself mentoring fewer people but writing more. He penned letters, handwritten ones, to people he met briefly but remembered deeply, to judges, to janitors, to the grocery store clerk who once whispered, "I saw what they did to you, I prayed you'd be okay." Each letter began the same way, "You matter more than you know." And in the end, when David passed, his funeral was not grand. It was quiet, modest, like the man himself. But they came. From cities and towns and counties you'd never connect on a map. They brought stories, not headlines, not photos, but moments. A man stood and said, "I was going to quit, but he told me to stay calm." A woman said, "He showed me that quiet isn't weakness." A child, only 10, recited, "Truth doesn't shout, it stands." And in that moment, as sunlight poured through stained glass and warmed the worn wood of the pews, you could feel it. David never needed a statue. His legacy had already been carved into choices, into courage, into a quiet revolution of restraint and resolve. He had spoken up, not to be heard, but to remind us we still have a voice, and now it's ours to use wisely. The seeds David planted didn't die with him. In fact, they bloomed in the most unexpected places, sometimes in silence, sometimes in the roar of someone finally refusing to stay silent. One of the first to carry his lessons forward was his daughter, Maya. She'd been just a little girl when the trial happened, too young to grasp its full weight, but old enough to feel the tension in every room her father walked into. She remembered the nights he tucked her in, whispering, "Never let them shrink your truth." For a while, she tried to forget it all. She went off to college, studied architecture, and tried to live quietly. but her father's words echoed, louder than the lectures. It wasn't until one day, when Maya sat in a client meeting for a new courthouse design, that something shifted. A senior partner wanted the front entrance redesigned. Too much glass. People don't need to see inside a courtroom, he said dismissively. But Maya disagreed, vehemently. People do need to see inside, she said. If justice happens, in the dark, it's not justice. The room went still. She knew she had just risked her job, but something strange happened. Another colleague, silent until that moment, said quietly, "I agree with her." The design stayed. That courthouse now stands with a front entirely made of glass, floor to ceiling. School tours walk through it. On the side, etched into the marble near the steps, are 5 words. Truth doesn't shout. It stands. She never put her father's name there. Because he wouldn't have wanted it. He would have said, "It's not about me, it's about us." Then there was Terence James, the young police officer David once helped. Back then, Terence had been newly recruited, full of hope but drowning in doubt. He'd seen what happened to David on the news. The footage of that confrontation, the lies, the courtroom, it made him question his own badge. One day, Terence found himself in a similar position. A black teenager was being accused of theft in a gas station. No proof, just a gut feeling from the store owner. Terence arrived. Everyone expected him to cuff the kid and haul him off, but he didn't. He calmly asked to see the security footage. He pulled it up, examined the timeline, and clearly saw the boy hadn't stolen anything. He'd been wrongly accused. Terence let the boy go, and then quietly walked the store owner through what implicit bias looks like. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't go viral, but it changed everything. The store owner apologized to the teen. A week later, Terence received a note in his department mailbox. No name on the envelope, just a folded sheet of paper that read, "You remembered the truth. That's more than most remember these days. Thank you." He kept that note in his vest pocket every shift, and eventually Terence rose through the ranks. When he became police chief, he introduced a new program, Community Clarity, requiring officers to review evidence fully before making arrests in claims involving minors or unverified accusations. David's lessons lived there too, not as slogans, but as practices. And then there was Elijah. He was just 10 when he met David. His school had invited David to speak during a civics class. Elijah sat in the front row, wide-eyed, asking question after question. "Why didn't you just yell at the judge? Were you scared when they lied? Did you ever want to run away?" David had laughed and said, "I didn't run because the truth can't walk without someone to carry it." Years later, Elijah became a public defender, and in his first real trial he defended a woman wrongfully accused of stealing medical supplies from a hospital where she worked night shifts as a janitor. The system tried to swallow her whole. Her English was broken, her past was rough, and the prosecutor was brutal. But Elijah stood tall. He remembered how David paused between words, not to seem powerful, but to let the truth breathe. He did the same. The jury acquitted the woman in less than an hour. And that night, Elijah stood in the parking lot outside the courthouse, looked up at the stars and whispered, "I didn't run." Years passed, and Elijah didn't forget. In fact, he made it his mission not only to defend the voiceless, but to teach them how to speak. It started with community workshops. Just a few people at first, single mothers who had been evicted, teenagers charged for petty crimes, immigrants facing quiet injustices. Elijah taught them how to read legal documents, how to ask questions in court, how to stand their ground without raising their voice. He didn't call it a non-profit. He called it a table. "Because everyone deserves a seat," he would say. Soon, other young lawyers joined. Some of them were his former clients, some were students who had seen his cases online. And without anyone planning it, a quiet movement began to stir. They didn't hold protests with megaphones. They held conversations in back rooms of churches, community centers, barbershops. They rewrote city ordinances. They trained young men and women on what to do when you're stopped, what your rights are, and more importantly, how not to lose yourself in a world that keeps trying to erase you. Elijah called the growing group the quiet jury, a nod to the 12 strangers who had once heard David's truth and didn't turn away. Eventually, the quiet jury reached national attention, not because of scandals or outrage, but because of results. Cities with chapters of the group saw fewer wrongful arrests, more dismissed cases, more judges questioning faulty testimonies, and perhaps most powerfully, more young people believing they had a future without folding to the system. One evening, after a long day of hearings, Elijah was locking up the small brick building that housed the group's headquarters when a soft knock tapped on the glass. A boy, maybe 16, stood there holding a folded piece of paper. Elijah opened the door, and the boy said quietly, "My mom said you helped her a long time ago. She wanted me to give you this." Elijah unfolded it. It was old, creased, written in blue ink. It read, "Never let them shrink your truth. Carry it, walk it, live it." Elijah recognized the handwriting immediately. It was David's. His hands trembled slightly. "Where did you get this?" he asked. Boy replied, "My mom said a man gave it to her outside a courtroom once. Said she needed to be the kind of woman who raised a man that wouldn't be afraid of silence." Elijah didn't say anything for a long time. He just looked at the paper, then back at the boy. "You're already halfway there," he whispered. Years later, when Elijah was invited to speak at a national legal symposium, he told the audience, "Something simple. We think justice is a shout, but sometimes it's a whisper that refuses to disappear. There were no standing ovations, no tears. Just a silence that held weight. That's how you know truth is in the room." And as the movement continued, those touched by David's story began planting seeds in their own ways. A teacher in St. Louis introduced a truth circle at the start of every week, where students could say what scared them, what made them angry, what made them feel unseen. A nurse in Atlanta created a program called Dignity First, which provided translated documents and advocates for patients who didn't speak English, so they wouldn't be rushed, misdiagnosed, or ignored. A formerly incarcerated man in Chicago opened a bakery and named it Redemption Loaf. On his wall was a quote, "Bread rises quietly, so does justice." None of them claimed to be heroes. None of them were trying to be viral. They were just living with intention, walking the truth David carried, one step at a time. Elijah noticed the shift first in letters, not court summons or legal documents, but handwritten notes, typed emails. From high school teachers, community college instructors, even law school professors.